I will share today some of the insights I've learned over the past years of studying digital media uses in adolescents and how it relates to their overall well-being. The questions in general that we ask in our research group relate all to the digital age, the digital growing up, and in which ways this surrounded media environment can help youth to flourish, or whether it sometimes impairs their well-being, and what we can do to make sure youth is not harmed by the deep penetration of digital media in their everyday lives, and how we can make sure that they have all the necessary tools, skills to truly flourish when using digital media. To answer such research questions, we usually integrate an interdisciplinary approach in which especially insights from psychology are merged with communication theories. Most of our work is multi-method, meaning that we do all kinds of survey studies, but also content analysis and qualitative work. Of course, I do not do this work alone, so before I kick off with the things we've encountered during the last years and what we found, I would like to give a thank you to my team who is working along with me in these studies and with whom I can do all this research on digital media effects and youth. They all pursue different areas and looking at how digital media affects the growing up of youth, and you can see some of these areas covered on this slide. But now I would like to start with the research we have done. And as you know, I think teenagers are today spending huge amounts of time with their smartphones. Some sources even say that youth spend more time with digital media than they sleep or talk to friends or spend time at school. So there have been raised, of course, concerns about the activities that digital media offer to these children, and whether all of these activities allow them to benefit from their uses, or whether some of them may harm them. And this debate is also clear in the public press. The public discourse has also a lot to say about the effects of digital media and social media in particular. I'm sure you all listened to Frances Haugen, who claimed, I think it was last year, that Meta, the new name for the company of Facebook, is covering up a huge scandal in which children are deliberately almost harmed by their social media uses. And she came out with some numbers in which teens claimed themselves that they, especially girls, suffered from their use of social media. Such voice was not new. It received especially attention because it came from a former employee of the company. We also have heard these things in the past with journalists saying that social media is especially giving us images to compare to, and that nobody will become happy from those comparisons. So the question is there, what proof is there in research for these claims? An interesting thing here is, of course, that the research debate is also polarized, I can say maybe, because some say yes, digital media uses harm youth, and others say no, or a mixed answer, let's say. I don't know whether you followed the most recent discussion on this topic came, I think, from John Haidt, when the mental health numbers in US teens were released, and in which we saw that they almost had doubled within a time span of, I think, something like 10 years. And of course, one notable difference between then and now is that teens today use a lot of more social media, an observation that has been also made in the past by scholars like Zwenge, and who speak of a generation of pressured youth, and that this pressure is supposed to come from mobile media, social media being always available to anyone and of course also being able to see any kind of images of your peers, of influencers at any time. Other scholars say no. If we look at the hard empirical evidence, meaning screen time use, and so the time they spend on social media, on their smartphones, we do not see strong evidence for a consistent link between screen time or social media time and a poor mental health. These numbers are not convincing to say social media harm, but there's more to say. And I would like to illustrate that today, that the debate is not black or white, but that it's very much more layered, and that we're sometimes missing this complexity, I believe, in these discussions, because there is not such a thing, I think, as the social media effect or the effect of digital media. It's very layered. And today I would like to unpack some of these layers together with you with one example of a social media interaction. So, digital media are an opportunity or a threat? Well, basically in communication science, most scholars agree that we can estimate the effects or predict the effects of digital media interactions as long as we take certain factors into account. And if we know what factors are involved, we can start predicting what the effects can be of social media uses. So first important thing is that screen time, the time you spend with social media, is basically seen as a very bad indicator, because it does not tell you what you do, what you're doing on your phone, on your social media. It can be that you're communicating with your best friend and making fun, which is clearly something different than when you're scrolling to the content posted by Fit Inspiration. Similarly, the environment in which you are scrolling through your social media is relevant. Are you paying full attention? Are you focusing at the same time on something else? What happened before the interaction took place? These are all factors we should consider to understand how effective an interaction can be at some point. Similarly, not everyone is the same in how he or she responds to social media interactions or digital media interactions in general. There are certain traits at a macro level, meaning the country in which you live, the cultural context in which you're growing up, which make that you have different ideas about certain activities regarding digital media. Same is true for meso traits like the school you're going to, or micro traits, and those are especially situated in psychology literature, such as your personality, things like sensation-seeking levels. They all also matter to see how you respond to a certain digital media interaction. A final factor here is time span, because as I will illustrate later, it has been proven that social media effects or digital media effects in general differ depending on whether we see them evolving over the time span over a year, or on a very short time span, such as directly after exposure, or on a day-to-day level. So the time is also a crucial component to understand how social media shapes one's well-being. To understand how these factors have proven to be relevant in digital media interactions, I would like to discuss today with you a case study. And I'm sure you're quite familiar with the content I would like to focus on today, because if you scroll through your social media, I'm sure you notice that most people present themselves in a positive way. Most people are smiling, are sharing happy moments. Social media, especially the public platforms, this is what I'm speaking of. So platforms such as Instagram, which are very visually oriented, have a certain bias that we label in the literature as the positivity bias. And it's the tendency of users to overly positively present themselves and to share especially images of themselves in which they look pretty, happy, are doing fun activities, or are spending time with their best friends or their boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse. So all kind of images that come over as very positively, and those images we frame as the positivity bias, and they make the critique that Instagram is a picture perfect place. So I'm sure this all sounds familiar to most of you. So if we look at this particular type of content, we can have a look at what it means, let's say, how does it come, how does it show to express the positivity bias? And next we have been looking on how this actually has an effect. And we have done that especially in longitudinal studies, which allow us to capture its effect over a longer term. But we've also conducted some diary studies, experience sampling studies, but then on a day-to-day level, which allowed us to estimate how the effect fluctuates on a day-to-day basis. And I would like to share today some of the insights we collected when doing these studies. I'll focus for the lecture of today on the exposure effect, so what it means to be exposed to this content. For the self-posting of such content, you can always contact me if you like to hear something more about that. But typically we have different theories, let's say, to explain self-effect. So for the case study of today, I focus on exposure effects. But it's very important to consider that that does not mean that exposure effects are the same as self-posting effects, because a very different mechanism happens when you're creating content yourself and next exposing it to an audience. It's a different effect process, of course, than when you're being exposed to something in your environment that you can observe and next learn from. So how does the positivity bias come across? And in our research, we usually focus on youth. Why? Because of course, adolescents are growing up, and one of the crucial tasks of growing up is to form an own identity, but also to become more independent of your parents and to turn more to your peers. This makes that adolescents are believed developmentally to be more susceptible to the content that comes from their peers, but also highly admiring figures like influencers, because they're shaping their identity and they're very sensitive to picking up norms and forming their own self-concept. So that's why traditionally we look at messages from peers or from figures who are highly popular within the group of adolescents. And so when studying the positivity bias on social media, a first group of posters that we have looked at are influencers. This study was done with a sample of influencers coming from 3 different countries. So influencers from here in Belgium, but also from the US and from China. Why did we choose those 3 countries? Because they have, of course, a very different cultural setting. While the US is known to be a very individualistic focus, and so something that very much aligns with the self-culture on social media and the focus on oneself, which happens when influencers post, of course. They're a very interesting country, let's say, to compare to countries who are less individualistic. And here do we position Belgium, at least according to Hofstede's categorization, of which I think you are familiar with. And then finally, we chose China because it's believed traditionally to be a more collectivistic country with less individualistic values. And so we wondered, when we take the most popular influencers from those 3 countries with different individualistic, collectivistic values, will this come across in different self-presentation practices in how they present themselves online and how they participate in the positivity bias? With this study, we especially wanted to learn, like, how does the positivity bias gets shaped by influencers, because you can present a very positive image of yourself in very different ways, and we wanted to distract the themes coming out of these posts. And so we took a total of more than 1,000 Instagram posts coming from different influencers out of different countries. And we first inductively looked at a subsample of this sample to see what are the themes coming across. And next, deductively, we coded how often these different themes or frames came across. If you have a question, please stop me and ask your question. We found different frames, and the first, not surprisingly, theme was, of course, the look at me, which is typically a selfie, and which is very much focused on showing your followers how perfect you appear, and your compliance to the different narrow appearance ideals, especially regarding facial features. Another frequently covered theme was showing how popular you are, or how much you are into a very ideal relationships, and so the joy you receive out of hanging with others, being popular, being loved, was another very prevalent theme. Another thing was to show that you do exciting activities, that you have pleasure in your life by exploring new things, and stressing the novelty and pleasure out of trying out new things. We call this frame the busy bee frame. Another frame was showing what accomplishments people had achieved. This was less prevalent, but still it appeared once in a while, and it very explicitly showed how successful the influencer had been in a certain attaining a certain goal. A final frame we found was the expert frame, in which influencers showed their professional skills and how much they knew about the profession they were doing. So if they were beauty advisors, they shared advice about beauty. If they were health advisors, they shared health advice. So it always showed them, but how much they excelled also in their own profession, by also sharing advice based on the very high achievements they made themselves. So overall, we saw that there were different ways in showing a very positive image of yourself, in how influencers give shape to the positivity bias. The most used frame here was a look at me, so the fact that you share a selfie or especially show your idealized appearance. The most liked frame was also then, not surprisingly, the look at me frame, so the fact that you're showing pictures of how you appear is very much liked by the audience of influencers. The look at me frame also appeared as to be the most sexualized, which is of course not so surprisingly, that they apply a very objectifying perspective in these pictures, as they are very much focused on appearance. As for cultural differences, we did not find it this extensively. We found some, but not many. And the first was the fact that exciting activities like the I'm a busy bee occurred more in less individualistic countries, so in China and Belgium, in comparison to America. While reversely, the very individualistic self-presentation of one's appearance was the most done in the US as compared to the very collectivistic country of China. So this gives us some insights in how influencers are presenting themselves online. And of course, influencers are not the only content teens encounter when scrolling online. So we also had a look on how peers share images that adhere to the positivity bias online. And we first asked that by asking adolescents straightforward to a self-report survey, how often do you post these kind of images that are very positively in different teams? And so we conducted a survey, including more than 1,800 adolescents. Children here answered that they shared regularly pictures on social media, on Instagram, in which they looked pretty, in which they seemed to have a lot of fun, in which they were happy or were on an adventurous trip. And as you can see by the percentiles noted, it was a pretty high amount of adolescents who indicated to very regularly share these kind of pictures. Around 70% for appearance, almost 90% for having fun, also almost 90% for being happy, and around 80% for doing something exciting. But of course, these are self-reports, so we wondered what happens when we ask adolescents to donate us some of their latest social media posts. And so we asked them to share the biography they currently have and the biographical pictures so they currently have on their Instagram, as also the most recent posts and stories they had shared with their peers. And we coded these print screens of their biographies and posts and stories to see to what extent they cover the positivity bias in terms of appearance, so showing oneself as highly attractive versus showing oneself as someone who is having fun, enjoys life, is hanging out with friends. And we found, not surprisingly, that the positivity bias was also present in these images. The study was done in 3 different countries. Again, we selected our countries based on their values towards individualism and collectivism, while France is highly individualistic in the context of Europe. Belgium is situated in the middle, and Slovenia is believed to be a rather collectivistic country with low values on individualism. Again, according to intercultural data that was available, I think, in the year of 2019. So for the biographical picture, we found that 1 out of 3 pictures stresses the positivity bias, and that it's especially focused on showing oneself as being pretty. Interestingly, the adolescents coming from our most collectivistic country, Slovenia, appear to stress this much more often than the ones coming from Belgium or from France. If we look at their most recent post, we saw that the positivity bias was even more present as compared to the biographical picture, because in 1 out of 2 posts, they appear to stress a very positive event or achievement or appearance. This happened the most, though, by showing how fun they were and less by showing how pretty they were. We also saw that, again, just like with the biographical picture, that Slovenian youth stressed more how they looked nice than French adolescents and Belgian adolescents. So we can say that the positivity bias is clearly present in the social media environment of adolescents. So this brings us, of course, to the question, what kind of effects can we expect from posting how pretty you are, how much fun you're having? How are these posts affecting your friends and other peers? So that's what we did in another series of studies, because you can expect 2 things from all these positive posts. Something positive can happen, and it can help you to feel connected to peers, to feel happy about themselves. Yet on the other side, it can also trigger certain unwanted process, which may potentially harm one's well-being. And so we actually concluded over a series of studies on exposure to the positivity bias that it is highly important to distinguish between the different mechanisms that are at play. So which response do you have when you are being exposed to the positivity bias on social media, but also that this response can even change when looking at the time span. So when we're thinking about a short-term effect versus a long-term effect, it seems that different outcomes seem to prevail. So the question is getting complex on what conditions are is exposure to the positivity bias positive or negative. Let me explain you a bit more in detail. In our research, we've looked at two mechanisms in particular, the idea of upward comparisons and the idea following Higgins' theory, self-discrepancy theory, and different levels of the self, including the can self. But first, for upward social comparison, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Vestinger's social comparison theory, in which he explains that humans have a tendency to compare themselves to others. And he explains that you have different types of comparisons, processes, downward comparisons, lateral comparisons, or in our case, upward comparisons. We focus on upward social comparisons because on social media and the positivity bias in particular, on which we are focusing here in this research, people usually appear as picture perfect, as being very happy, as doing something very successful. So this makes it more like an upward comparison likely, we reasoned. And following this literature, upward social comparisons can lead to two types of outcomes. The first are rather negative, because the upward social comparison can make you aware that the other person is doing better than you are, and this can trigger all kinds of responses, of which envy is a well-known one, and one that we have used in research to understand under which conditions social media exposure to the positivity bias can negatively affect someone. But on the other hand, all these very positive images of others who are considered to be upward models may also trigger inspiration for yourself to also achieve all of these good outcomes, and to also call your friends and hang out and be happy. And in this way, the upward social comparison process can theoretically also have a positive effect. And so the exposure to the positivity bias on social media, following this reasoning and thus the application of social comparison theory, can have two types of outcome. Of course, it shouldn't surprise that peer research has mostly looked at the effects of social comparisons regarding the negative well-being, so things like envy. Yet recently, responses such as inspiration have been increasingly taken into account, and this is also what we have done. Moreover, we took into account that it's even not, it is even possible that both envy and inspiration happen at the same time. So they are not mutually exclusive. They can occur at the same time within one person. So to test the role of upward social comparison processes in exposure to the positivity bias in adolescents, we organized a longitudinal study. The research had 3 waves of data collection. It was with a 4-month time interval. By this time interval, because other research on social media effects has recommended it as being developmentally appropriate when working with social media among adolescents. We also applied an online survey, and we had a sample at the end of the 3rd wave of more than 1,000 adolescents. Our analyses were, like always, pre-registered, and we applied the random intercept cross-leg model. We also did some moderation analysis, but I'll get back to that when I'm discussing what to do with the effects of the positivity bias. So I'll not go into detail here about the moderator we tested, but I'll get back to you later on this. Interesting is with the random intercept cross-leg panel model, of course, is that we can distinguish between variants from within person variants And so this really gives us an answer on the effect of exposure to the positivity bias, because before studies were limited to understand whether differences occur between persons, and so whether exposure to the positivity bias is related to a certain outcome in one individual, but that is different in another individual. It does not tell you actually something about changes within an individual, and that is what is possible when disentangling between from within person variance, because if you capture the within person variance, we can really see the changes over time and fluctuations in how someone is developing. And so the results were actually very interesting when disentangling this between versus within variance, because we saw when we looked at the between person level variance that actually all of our expected patterns were confirmed. So we saw that exposure to picture perfect appearances or general lifestyles, activities, achievements on social media in teens related to occurred social comparison processes. So these adolescents who were more being exposed to the positivity bias indicated that they also more often compared themselves to the models in these pictures, and they also indicated that we also saw that these comparison processes were related to higher levels of feeling envy towards the persons on social media, but also of being inspired by the content on social media. So both responses of envy and inspiration related to social comparison, and also related directly, interestingly, to exposure to the positivity bias. So here, the picture seems to confirm what we already read in peer literature, but it became really interesting when looking at the within person relations, so how people who fluctuated in how often they saw these picture perfect posts, how they were changing in how often they engaged in social comparisons and how often they felt these feelings of envy or inspiration. And here we saw a very mixed picture, actually. We saw not a lot of significant within personal associations, almost none. We did find one, namely two, namely that exposure to the perfect lives on Instagram related to inspiration over time. And so if you had more of this exposure, you felt more inspired 4 months later. And we also saw that those who had compared themselves a lot to the perfect images of social media felt more envy a wave later, so 4 months later. Yet, these relations were not stable across waves. So we found a pattern from wave 1 to wave 2 for perfect lives and inspiration, but not for the relation when seeing it at wave 2 to wave 3. And similarly, for social comparison and envy, the result was also not stable, as it did not occur when looking at social comparison and envy in their scores at wave 1 to wave 2. So there seemed to be something there of changes that happen over time within a certain individual, yet they were not stable across waves. One possible explanation can be COVID, because we had the pandemic kicking in our data collection, but still not clear why this would really then change our result in this way. So for longitudinal, very important to distinguish between and within variance, because you get different results. Then let's have a look at the other potential mediator of how you can respond to the picture perfect content on social media. These concepts, the Ken self, the discrepant self, they come from Higgins self-discrepancy theory, which I'm sure you're also familiar with. I think the Ken self is less covered in literature, as a lot has been going to discrepancy and how this relates negatively to people's well-being. But actually, Higgins also emphasizes the Ken self, and the Ken self is most related to what we just discussed regarding inspiration, because it's the idea that someone has about him or herself regarding all the attributes, the goals he or she can achieve or possess. And so it's the idea you have about yourself, your personality, about the things you think matter in your identity, and so which goals you should decide to commit to and which you can also commit to. This seems like something that can be triggered by the positivity bias, because seeing your friends engaging in all these fun activities, seeing them scoring well on school, having fun with a boyfriend, looking good, may trigger that they themselves can also do as good as their peers and also make them happy. At the same time, it's possible there's a game changer also, because it may trigger them awareness about all of their possibilities in the shape of their can self. Yet it can also make them aware that they have not yet reached their can self, so their best version of themselves. And so it makes them aware potentially about a certain self-discrepancy they're feeling, that they are not yet realizing their full potential. Such kind of realizations, such kinds of assessments about the self may potentially relate to how happy or unhappy you are feeling yourself also. So again, we applied here a longitudinal survey, and we especially focused this time in the longitudinal study on how exposure to the positivity bias related to feelings of self-discrepancy, and so how the positivity bias makes you aware that you're not achieving your best yet at the level of schoolwork, at being popular, at looking good, and all these, let's say, elements that we have seen in our content studies, coming back on what teens post about when participating in the social and the positivity bias in our content analytical work. Again, we applied a random intercept cross-lag model, and everything was pre-registered. Here we also tested a moderator. The moderator was internal locus of control, because it's believed to be a personality trait in which you give credit to certain successes, especially to yourself or to other people. And so we wondered that if you have a high internal locus of control, and so attribute responsibility to yourself when achieving well, but also when failing, this may moderate or intervene with how you respond to exposure to the positivity bias on social media, and feel less or more discrepant in your own self-concept in being highly successful, just like the others you're viewing on social media. And so we saw again an interesting pattern coming by when distinguishing between the within and the between person effects. Again, we did not find that fluctuating values in exposure to the positivity bias related over time to how adolescents were feeling high levels of self-discrepancy, and so were feeling that they were not yet there in using their full potential to be as successful as they want to be, or being as pretty as they want to be, doing as exciting stuff as they wanted to be. So those feelings were not dependent on the amount of posts they had seen in which peers or influencers were positively framed. Also, these patterns did not differ depending on their internal locus of control. So again, no proof for long-term effect. What we did saw, that was again, if we looked at the between person relationships, that they were again confirmed. So again, you could see differences between adolescents depending how often they were exposed to this positivity bias, and those differences were always related to different levels of self-discrepancy, meaning that those who are more strongly engaging in the positivity bias online and seeing all these posts also felt more self-discrepant about their own self-concept. Yet, as I told you before, this was not fluctuating within an individual, and so whether he or she was more exposed did not directly relate into a change in these feelings of self-discrepancy over time. So in both longitudinal studies, we find proof for between-person links, but not for within-person links. And so this made us wonder a little bit, maybe the time span is too long, and maybe social media effects differ from day to day. And maybe the self-discrepancy shouldn't be seen as the outcome. Maybe it's a chain of events that happens, and we have to capture what happens before. And so it maybe makes more sense to first look at how it triggers certain awareness of ambitious goals in them, so the can self, and then maybe this can self can trigger a discomfort in them, a pressure to improve themselves if they feel they are not yet attaining their goals. So if they feel they're far away from attaining their goal. So we changed a little bit, let's say, the role of the variables in our model to also fit more what can happen directly after social media exposure, and so not on a long-term perspective. And so we conducted a diary study in which we asked adolescents for 14 days in a row to complete at the end of each day a brief survey of 10 minutes to see what kind of social media they had used, and of course, in particularly, whether they had been exposed to the positivity bias. And next, we also asked, of course, how they were feeling, how they felt about themselves, and whether they felt that they pressure to achieve better in life. And so, of course, we also, again, pre-registered our findings and our analysis. For this study, we only have, of course, within-person relations, as that is the typical analysis that is done. And interestingly, here we did find confirmation of our hypothesis, especially with regard to infrequent content, so content like traveling or exciting things that was less frequently encountered in those periods of 14 days. So when adolescents do participate in the positivity bias, but they do it in a way that is less frequently done, such as showing a very clear achievement in school or showing something like traveling, then we see that adolescents feel their can self lighting up, like that they become more aware of their own possibilities. Yet, this feeling of awareness of triggering ambition will only remain positive and not result into pressure if they feel they're not too far away from reaching this goal. So at a state level, we found proof for an effect of social media content, and especially one if it appears regarding a subject, a theme in which you feel you haven't reached your goals yet and are still far away. So the distance is large in expecting when you will reach it, because this will turn into pressure rather than saying the positive initial response of making you aware of your abilities and some positive goals you can set for yourself. So that was what we learned from doing these studies on exposure to the positivity bias. We found that on a longer term interval, it's very important to distinguish between person variance and within person variance, as the patterns look very differently when looking between individuals versus within an individual. We also found that if we want to have strong, let's say, within individual effects, we have to look at especially a day-to-day scale, a day-to-day level, because there seems to be the most strong proof that social media effects do take place. And there also, we do not know whether the effect is positive or negative automatically, because it changes depending on how the person is doing in regards of these goals, according to, of course, their own subjective assessments. So what to do with this knowledge? We know that there can be positive or negative effects following the positivity bias on social media. And of course, it's our goal, I think, as scholars working on this research, to make the best out of it and to make sure adolescents in the end really flourish online, and to be very open in the way we approach this subject and allow them to grow in their social media interactions, as we see it brings along positive but also negative things. So how can we foster especially these positive things? Well, usually you can see in most social media effect papers, scholars, and with the recommendation that we should work on social media literacy, and that we should organize more interventions to make them more literate, and to make sure they can flourish online. We agree with our team in Leuven, but we also found out this is a very complex process. You cannot just go to a class, give a social media literacy intervention, and expect that next the teens are ready to only engage in flourishing online interactions. It's necessary to really conceptualize this concept with the different components it has, because we also see that different protective effects occur when taking into account these different components. So how can we define social media literacy? We see social media literacy as a two-dimensional concept, as a concept that has two subcomponents, a cognitive one and an affective one. And these two components are necessary to call someone social media literate. So for the cognitive structure, this is especially about knowledge on the effects of social media, and in this context on the positivity bias. So knowing what social media can do to someone's self-concept, knowing that on days you feel you're not achieving your goals well, that you shouldn't be scrolling through your social media, while also knowing that on some situations this can help you get inspired and make you feel happy. A second component are the affective structures, and that is what to do with the emotions, the responses triggered by social media, knowing that you should stop scrolling, for instance, when you're feeling bad due to picture perfect posts, and that it's not a good time for you to post. These are affective structures. And so this together forms the social media literacy concept that we use in our research. We also developed for studying social media literacy a kind of framework based on peer research, in which we formalized the role it plays in social media interactions. So social media literacy is first in this model predicted to develop due to participatory mediation of social media literacy, which can be received from different actors like parents, peers, and educators. We expect that social media literacy will predict in what kind of interactions adolescents will engage online. And of course, it will also predict how they respond to these interactions. And so we've worked on understanding more systematically the role of social media literacy. And in the first study, we were especially intrigued by from whom do they learn social media literacy. And we especially looked here to the informal actors, because of course educators are different, and we wondered if we just look at their own environment, their own peers, their own parents, do they socialize effectively cognitive social media literacy and effective social media literacy? And surprisingly, we found that parents especially seem to socialize cognitive and affective structures in teens. Interestingly, also those who are more cognitive social media literate seem to, over time, receive more of this participatory socialization conversations with their parents, and so they also seem to be then stronger on the cognitive social media literacy component. But for the affective social media literacy, it did not seem to increase over time. These kind of conversations on social media, yet those coming from parents that discuss social media in open conversations with their children it seemed that they were stronger in effective social media literacy skills. Peers, on the other hand, were no socialization actors when it comes to cognitive social media literacy. So over time, we did not find any positive effects coming from peers in the building of cognitive or effective social media literacy. This is somewhat surprising because we know from our research that adolescents often talk to each other about the content that prevails on social media, yet it seems that during these conversations, adolescents do not grow in their social media literacy skills. While with parents who talk actually less often about social media with their children and often also feel a bit less skilled to talk about social media because they don't always use it that intensively themselves. These conversations really do seem to matter as it seems to help adolescents to grow cognitive and effective social media literacy. But of course, you can help growing social media literacy, but then the question remains, does it really protect you from harmful effects that you can receive when being exposed to the positivity bias, or also help you to flourish, let's say, and to really become inspired when being exposed to the positivity bias on social media? And for this, we included the social media literacy component also in one of the peer studies I presented, and we looked at it as a moderator for our model. And we saw that the relationship between social comparison and envy actually only was encountered by those adolescents with low effective social media literacy. So cognitive social media literacy was no moderator, but for those with low effective social media literacy, so those who have no good emotional strategies to respond to social media, they felt when comparing themselves to social media content on social media that they felt much more envy than those who have adequate social media literacy skills. Interesting also for the between-person relationships, you saw also interesting links with effective social media literacy, but again, not with cognitive social media literacy. We saw that those who were high in effective social media literacy participated more often in, who were low, let's say, in effective social media literacy, participated less often in the positivity bias, and they also had higher levels of self-esteem. So those with low effective social media literacy see more positively biased posts, and they feel lower levels of self-esteem, while those with high effective social media literacy have less participation in the positivity bias, and they have higher levels of self-esteem. So it seems that effective social media literacy may be more important to focus on than cognitive social media literacy. And this is surprising because if we look at prior interventions on social media literacy, they especially focus on triggering knowledge about social media, explaining how it works, certain strategic choices people make. But we found that these are maybe not the strategies that really protect or allow users to have more positive effects from being exposed to the positivity bias. So we wondered what happens if we can increase these effective social media literacy skills in adolescents. And this is actually the project we're working on now. We designed an intervention in which we can stimulate effective social media literacy skills. And we teamed up with some of the stakeholders in Belgium who typically already do a lot of work with children and work on media literacy in general. And what's next is that we're now running the analysis of an intervention check and comparing adolescents who have been exposed to our intervention materials or training material to train teens effective social media literacy skills. And if you're interested in this, you can of course email me. All the material is in Dutch, but of course, I'm happy to explain it to you if you have interest in this work. So you can see it a little bit here. So that is actually, I think, the end of my presentation. I think we're also at 3 o'clock, so that it's time maybe to shift to the question section. Thank you very much for hearing our story, the work we have done in Leuven. And I look forward to hearing your questions.